Marta Feld had been a nurse for 11 years. She knew a staged room when she walked into one. The supply depot at Camp Florence was not staged. That was the first problem. She had expected performance, the kind of deliberate display you arrange when you want prisoners to feel small. Instead, the shelves were organized the way shelves are organized when no one is expecting an audience. Practical, unself-conscious. Bandages stacked by size, not by appearance. Medication bottles turned with the labels facing inward, not out. Nobody had cleaned this room for their benefit. She walked the length of it once and said nothing. Behind her, Ingrid was already asking questions of the American corporal assigned to show them the facilities. Ingrid asked everything. That was her way. She collected information the way some people collect worry, constantly, without apparent purpose. Marta had always found it exhausting. Now she found it useful. Ingrid's questions gave her time to look without being watched looking. The morphine supply alone was enough to make her stop. In the field hospitals near Cherbourg, morphine had been counted by the vial. Each one logged, each one justified, each use documented against the need. She had watched soldiers die at a level of pain that morphine would have solved if there had been morphine to give. Here the supply was not counted in vials. It was counted in cases. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she found her explanation. America had not fought on its own soil. No bombing, no siege, no supply lines cut by retreating armies. Of course they had abundance. It was easy to be abundant when no one had touched your factories. It was easy to be generous with medicine you had never had to ration. The explanation was correct. She knew it was correct. She moved on. The 9 of them were given a barracks in the women's compound, separated from the main POW population by a fence and a row of administrative buildings. Their assignment was clear. They would work in the camp hospital alongside American medical staff, treating German prisoners under Geneva Convention protocols. They would be treated as medical personnel, not combatants. They would be returned to German lines when the exchange was arranged. That night, Marta sat on the edge of her bunk and made a list in her head of everything she had seen. The supply depot, the hospital ward with its electric lighting and its adjustable beds, the pharmacy she had passed briefly, its shelves so fully stocked that bottles stood 2 rows deep. The American nurses moving through corridors with the ease of people who had never been asked to do more, with less. She built an explanation for each item. Propaganda about American weakness had always been about willpower, not resources. She had known this. The Americans had resources. They had always had resources. That was not in dispute. What was in dispute was whether resources made a nation strong in the way that mattered. Whether a people accustomed to abundance could endure what a people accustomed to sacrifice could endure. By the time she finished the list, she was satisfied. She slept without difficulty. The first shift was surgical prep. Marta was assigned to the prep room under a lieutenant she had not yet met. The other nurses were sent to the wards, to intake, to the pharmacy. Ingrid went to intake and looked pleased about it. Marta went to surgical prep and looked at nothing in particular. Lieutenant Anne Cross arrived without announcement. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years older, with the kind of face that gave nothing away in professional settings and probably didn't give much away anywhere else either. She looked at Marta's record sheet, not at Marta. Then she set the sheet down and began checking the surgical tray. She did not introduce herself except to say her name and rank. She did not explain the procedure they were preparing for. She simply began working and left space for Marta to work alongside her, which Marta did. The silence was not uncomfortable. That surprised Marta more than she wanted to admit. She had expected condescension, a particular American variety of it, the generous kind, the kind that explains obvious things slowly and calls it education. Instead, Cross checked instruments the way Marta checked instruments, with the focus of someone who understood that a surgical tray is not a formality. A Wehrmacht corporal was brought in. Leg wound, 5 days infected, the kind of infection that in a German field hospital would have been resolved by amputation, because the alternative required what they didn't have. Cross reviewed the chart. She ordered penicillin. Marta knew about penicillin. She had read about it the way you read about things that exist in principle but not in practice. In principle, penicillin resolved infections that would otherwise kill or cripple. In practice, German forces had seen almost none of it. Here it was administered without ceremony. A corporal noted the dosage. Cross signed the chart. The drug was prepared and given. Marta prepped the tray and said nothing. 4 days later, she passed the ward and saw the corporal sitting up in his bunk eating from a tray. The leg was still there. The infection was gone. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she told herself, exceptional circumstance. New drug, correctly administered patient was young and otherwise healthy. This was not representative. You did not build a conclusion on a single case. She was right about that too. She went back to work. That evening, Ingrid sat beside her at supper and said, "The intake system here is faster than anything I've seen." Marta ate without responding. "They process a new admission in under 20 minutes, Ingrid said. "Complete history, examination, assigned ward. 20 minutes. They have the staff for it. It's not just staff, it's the system, the forms, the sequence, the way information moves between departments." Ingrid paused. "It works." Marta looked at her. "You've been here 4 days. I know what I'm looking at. You're looking at what they want you to look at." Ingrid picked up her fork. "I don't think so." She said it quietly, without argument, which was worse than if she had pushed back. Ingrid was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. Marta knew that. She had known it for 3 years. She filed it under. "Ingrid is tired. The crossing had been long. The adjustment was real. People said careless things when they were tired." She finished her meal. On the way back to the barracks, she passed the far end of the hospital building and through the window saw a woman she didn't recognize running a procedure at the bedside of a German prisoner. The technique was correct, more than correct, efficient in the particular way of someone who has performed it hundreds of times and stopped thinking about the individual steps. Marta looked at the woman's face. She was black. Marta stood at the window for a moment. She reached for the explanation, the usual one, the familiar architecture of it, the way it had always arrived when she needed it. It did not come as quickly as it should have. She walked back to the barracks and lay down and looked at the ceiling and waited for it to arrive on its own. It did. Eventually. But the delay bothered her in a way she did not write down anywhere and did not say to anyone, not even to herself in the direct language of thought. She simply noted the delay and set it aside. Tomorrow she would go back to work. That was always the answer. Go back to work. Keep the hands moving. Keep the mind where it belonged. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Arizona night was doing what desert nights do. Cooling fast, the temperature dropping with a completeness that the day gave no indication of. She had not expected that. She had expected the heat to stay. Another thing she had been wrong about. She did not add it to any list. Marta came to Camp Florence expecting weakness. Instead, every day seems to challenge something she thought she knew. What do you think has affected her the most so far? The medical results, the professionalism of the American staff, or the way people are judged by their ability rather than their background? Let us know in the comments, and tell us what part of US you're watching from today. And please leave a like and subscribe to help us. The second week settled into a routine that Marta found easier to manage than the first. Routine was useful. It gave the mind a track to run on and kept it from wandering into territory that produced no useful conclusions. She woke at the same time, ate at the same table, walked the same corridor to the surgical prep room, and worked alongside Lieutenant Cross with the focused efficiency of two professionals who had stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. That part she had not expected. Cross did not explain things Marta already knew. She did not slow down for her. She did not perform patience. She simply worked at the level the work required and expected Marta to meet her there, which Marta did, and which Cross acknowledged with nothing more than the occasional nod that meant, correct, continue. It was the most honest professional arrangement Marta had been inside in years. She did not say this to anyone. On the 9th day, a new case came through. A Wehrmacht sergeant, late 30s, chest wound from a training accident 3 weeks prior that had been badly managed in transit. By the time he reached Camp Florence, the infection had spread beyond the wound site. A German field surgeon who had seen the case 2 days earlier had written in the chart, Amputation of the arm probable. Sepsis risk high. Cross read the chart without expression. Then she ordered a full course of penicillin and a surgical consult. Marta prepped the tray and watched. The consulting surgeon was a captain named Reeves, a civilian doctor in uniform, who had the particular manner of someone who found most problems solvable and most urgency unnecessary. He reviewed the chart, examined the wound, spoke briefly with Cross, and recommended a course of treatment that did not include amputation. 3 days later, the sergeant's fever broke. 5 days after that, he was sitting up. Marta changed his dressing on the morning of the 6th day and looked at the wound with the eye of someone who understood what she was seeing. The infection was clearing. The tissue around it was healthy. The arm was there. She did the dressing correctly and said nothing and went back to the prep room. She did not reach for an explanation immediately. She let the fact sit for a while, the way you let a calculation sit when you are not sure you want to confirm the answer. Then she found it. 2 cases. 2 cases of penicillin resolving infections that German medicine would have resolved differently. 2 cases proved nothing except that the drug worked, which she had already known in principle. The question was not whether the drug worked. The question was what it meant that they had it in the quantities they had it. And the answer to that was the same answer she had given herself in the supply depot on the first day. Resources, industry, an undamaged continent. Not character, not philosophy, not some fundamental difference in what medicine was for. She was satisfied with this. She went to supper. Ingrid was not at the table. Marta found her after the meal, sitting outside the barracks on the low step, with her hands around a cup of water, looking at the fence line in the particular way of someone who is not looking at the fence line at all. Marta sat beside her. "You missed supper." "I wasn't hungry." Marta waited. "I assisted with a procedure today," Ingrid said. "Captain Reeves. He talked through the whole thing, not to me, just out loud, explaining his thinking, why he made each decision." She paused. "He didn't have to do that. I was just holding the tray." "He was thinking out loud. He was teaching." Ingrid looked at her cup. "He knew I was a nurse. He knew I was trained. He talked to me like someone who could understand what he was doing and had a right to understand it." Marta said nothing. "In 4 years," Ingrid said, "no doctor talked to me like that. You were in a war. So was he." Ingrid set the cup down. "Marta, I am not saying this to argue. I am saying it because I think you are seeing the same things I am, and I don't understand why you keep putting them somewhere else." Marta looked at the fence line. "I am not putting anything anywhere. I am being careful. You are being exhausted." The word landed harder than Ingrid probably meant it to. Marta stood. "Get some sleep." She went inside and lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling and told herself, Ingrid is not tired anymore. That explanation was gone now. Ingrid had slept, Ingrid had eaten, Ingrid had settled. What Ingrid was now was something Marta needed a different word for. She chose susceptible. Ingrid had always been open in ways that Marta was not. It was a quality Marta had valued in her as a colleague and quietly worried about as a tendency. Susceptibility was not the same as perception. Being moved by something was not the same as being right about it. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. The 3rd week brought Eleanor. Marta did not learn her name immediately. She was aware of her the way you become aware of any person in a shared workspace. Peripherally, gradually, through repeated proximity. She worked the ward adjacent to surgical prep. She moved through it with the same unhurried efficiency that Marta had noticed through the window in the 1st week. Her name was Eleanor, Lieutenant Eleanor. Marta heard Cross use it once in passing and filed it without intending to. On a Wednesday, Eleanor was assigned to assist with a procedure in the prep room. Marta was already there. They worked on opposite sides of the table with a patient between them and Cross at the head. The procedure was straightforward, a drainage and dressing for a wound that had been allowed to close too early. Marta had done variations of it hundreds of times. Eleanor had too. That was visible in the first 30 seconds. She did not look at her hands. She did not hesitate between steps. She anticipated Cross's requirements the way Marta anticipated them, not by waiting to be asked, but by understanding the sequence well enough to be ready before the ask arrived. Twice, she and Marta reached for the same instrument at the same moment. The first time, Eleanor pulled back and let Marta take it. The second time, Marta pulled back and let Eleanor take it. Neither of them said anything. Cross said nothing. The procedure continued. When it was finished, Eleanor stripped her gloves and left the room without ceremony, the way all of them left rooms when the work was done. Marta cleaned the tray. She was looking for the argument, the one that explained what she had just worked alongside. She had a version of it, had always had a version of it, built from things she had been taught and things she had repeated long enough that they had started to feel like things she had observed. The version did not fit what she had just seen. She tried a different version. That one fit less well. She finished cleaning the tray and set it on the rack and stood at the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the surface. Cross was still in the room, writing in the patient's chart. Without looking up, she said, "You and Lieutenant Eleanor work at the same speed." It was not a question. Marta said, "Yes." Cross nodded once and kept writing. Marta left the room. She walked back to the barracks at the end of the shift and sat on her bunk and did not make a list and did not build an explanation and did not file anything anywhere. She just sat. Outside, the desert light was doing what it did in the late afternoon, going flat and wide and honest, the kind of light that removes shadow from things and leaves them exactly as they are. Marta sat in the barracks and let it come through the window. For the first time since she had arrived at Camp Florence, she did not immediately reach for something to put between herself and what she had seen. She was aware of that. She did not know what to do with it. She picked up her notebook and opened it and wrote 2 lines about the procedure, clinical and correct, and then stopped and looked at what she had written and closed the notebook without adding anything else. Tomorrow, she would go back to work. That was still the answer, but it was beginning to feel like a different question. By the 3rd month, Marta had stopped counting the shelves in the supply room. That was not a small thing. Counting had been her first defense when she arrived, a way to keep the camp from becoming too large in her head. She counted morphine cases, dressings, instruments, beds, hours. She counted the steps between the prep room and the pharmacy. She counted the number of times a nurse corrected a chart, the number of patients discharged, the number of times Cross said nothing because nothing needed saying. Now she was no longer counting. She was just noticing. The first thing she noticed was that the numbers kept supporting the wrong argument. The ward with the infected chest wound had been the clearest case. The sergeant was standing now, walking the corridor with a stiffness that made sense after injury but no longer suggested amputation. Marta had changed his last dressing 2 days earlier and seen healthy tissue where she had expected damage. The arm was still there. The infection had been stopped. She had told herself the case was exceptional. Then another came in, then another. Not the same injury, not the same patient, not the same outcome in every detail, but the same principle repeated often enough to make the principle hard to deny. Penicillin worked. The Americans had enough of it to use it consistently. The doctors here did not treat that abundance as a miracle. They treated it as a condition of the work. Marta did not like that part. A miracle was easier to dismiss. A system was harder. Cross noticed what Marta was looking at before Marta said anything. They were in the corridor outside surgical prep after a morning case. Cross had a chart tucked under one arm and a pencil behind her ear. Marta was carrying a basin. The corridor was empty except for them. "The sergeant from Ward C," Marta said. "He shouldn't be walking yet." "He is walking," Cross said. Marta looked at her. "You know what I mean." Cross stopped beside her. "I know exactly what you mean." That was all. No smile, no lecture, no attempt to make the conversation into a lesson. Just a fact recognized by another professional. Marta should have felt defensive. Instead, she felt unsettled, which was worse. "Where did you learn to work like this?" Marta asked before she could stop herself. Cross turned the chart over in her hand. "In hospitals." A pause. "And in places where you don't have the luxury of doing things badly." Marta heard the answer and hated that it was a good one. She said, "Germany doesn't have the luxury either." Cross looked at her for a moment. "Then why are the outcomes different?" There it was. Not a challenge. Not even really an accusation. Just the shape of a question Marta was not ready to answer without first losing something she still needed. She looked away. There are many variables. Cross nodded once, as if she had expected that answer and found it accurate enough to move on from. Yes, she said, there are. Then she walked on. Marta stood in the corridor with the basin in her hands and understood that Cross had done something no one had done to her in years. She had not argued back. She had left the question in the room. Ingrid was becoming harder to explain away. At first Marta had kept calling her tired. Tired from travel, tired from change, tired from work. It had been a useful explanation because it required no threat to Marta's own thinking. If Ingrid saw things differently, it was because she was worn down. That was all. But tired people do not remember details the way Ingrid remembered them. That evening at supper, Ingrid said, "Dr. Reeves changed the dosage without being asked." Marta looked up. He reviewed the chart twice and adjusted the treatment before the nurse finished reading the intake. Ingrid said, "He didn't have to. Cross had already ordered the course." Then why did he change it? Because the chart showed the patient had reacted badly to the first dose at the prior camp. Ingrid tore bread in half and looked at the pieces. He noticed what the system already knew and corrected it. Marta said, "That is what he is supposed to do." "Yes," Ingrid said. "It is." The way she said it was not confrontational. It was more dangerous than that. She was agreeing. Marta ate in silence. Later that night, she saw Ingrid on the step outside the barracks, notebook in hand. Marta paused at the door. "You're writing again." Ingrid looked up. "Yes." "About what?" "Work." Marta waited for more. Ingrid closed the notebook and rested her hands on it. "You should do it too." "Why?" "Because one day you will want to remember what this looked like before you learn to explain it away." Marta almost answered sharply. Instead, she said, "Explain what away?" Ingrid held her gaze. "You know exactly what." Marta looked past her toward the fence line. The desert was darkening in that flat way it had, the light leaving without drama. Camp Florence was quiet but not empty. Never empty. There were always footsteps somewhere, a gate closing, a distant voice, a cartwheel against pavement. Always the camp continuing itself. Marta said, "You are changing." Ingrid did not deny it. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I cannot keep saying the old things to myself and still believe the evidence in front of me." Marta didn't answer. Ingrid opened her notebook again. "That doesn't mean I know everything. It means I know when something isn't fitting anymore." Marta left her there and went inside. The next week brought the moment she could not neatly file. A ward order came through for a bedside procedure in the recovery unit. Marta was assigned to assist. Cross was already there. Eleanor would be joining them. Eleanor arrived without hurry, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back, chart in hand. She took her place on the other side of the bed and checked the tray with the same economy Marta had seen before. There was no unnecessary motion in her. No performance, just work. The patient was a young German prisoner with a post-operative drainage issue. The procedure was not complicated, but it required timing and attention. Cross gave the sequence once. Marta and Eleanor moved with her. The first time the instrument exchange came, Eleanor reached first and Marta let her take it. The second time, Marta reached first and Eleanor yielded without comment. The third time, they both moved at the same instant. Then both paused. Then Eleanor looked at Marta very briefly and said, "Yours." Marta took the instrument. It was not the instrument that mattered. It was the fact that Eleanor had recognized the moment, named it in one word, and made the room move on. Cross did not look up. She didn't need to. The procedure finished cleanly. When the patient was settled and the tray cleared, Marta stood at the steel counter washing her hands harder than necessary. Eleanor was at the other sink. She was silent for a while, then said, without turning her head, "You work well." Marta looked at her. It was a simple sentence. That was what made it dangerous. "Thank you," Marta said. Eleanor nodded once. Marta waited for the rest of the explanation she knew she wanted to hear. Something about training, about standards, about the particularities of military procedure, something that would let her categorize the compliment and put it back into a box where it could be harmless. Eleanor gave her nothing else. That was the end of the exchange. But when Marta left the room, she knew she had been changed by a sentence that contained no argument at all. That night she opened her notebook and wrote to Anna. She had not decided to. It simply happened. Today I worked beside a nurse who said one word and made a room continue moving. She stopped, read it, added, "I know how this sounds. I know how it would sound if I were still trying to defend the ideas I brought with me. But I am no longer sure the ideas are doing any work here except protecting me from having to think further." She paused again. Outside the barracks someone laughed. A real laugh, not one from training or procedure or obligation. Marta looked toward the sound and then back at the page. The Americans let nurses speak to doctors directly when they think the order is wrong. I watched it happen. The doctor listened. He changed the order. She set the pen down. The sentence irritated her because it was hard to argue with and harder to dismiss. Not because America was ideal, not because the system was flawless, but because the correction had improved the outcome. That fact did not care about the ideology she had brought with her. She wrote one more line. "I am beginning to think that some of what I was taught about strength was just another word for fear." She sat with that sentence for a long time before writing anything else. Then she stopped. It was enough for one night. Not because she had finished the thought, because for the first time she had written a sentence she could not immediately take back. By the 4th month, Marta stopped thinking of the camp as a place she was temporarily passing through. That was the beginning of the problem. A temporary place could be explained. A temporary place could be measured, compared, dismissed. But routine changed things. The same corridor every morning, the same surgical tray, the same voices, the same order of events repeating until they stopped feeling like an interruption and started feeling like a system. Systems were harder to argue with. That morning, the recovery ward had the kind of case Marta could have managed in her sleep. A post-operative dressing had been applied too tightly on the previous shift, not dangerously tight, just enough to irritate the wound and slow the drainage. The doctor on duty was Captain Reeves, a civilian man in uniform with a careful hand and the habit of checking his own work twice. He looked down at the chart, then at the dressing, then back at Marta. "Too snug," he said. It was not a question, it was also not a performance. Just a technical observation made by someone who had already accepted the possibility of being wrong. Marta nodded. She had already seen it. Cross stood at the foot of the bed with her arms folded, waiting. Reeves said, "I'd left the last wrap one layer too high." Cross answered without heat. "Then loosen it." He did. The correction took less than a minute. No discussion, no embarrassment, no loss of authority that anyone in the room seemed to notice. That was the part that lodged in Marta's mind. In Germany, a mistake was something a structure had to hide. A proper system did not allow visible correction. Correction meant weakness. Weakness spread. A doctor who admitted an error in front of nurses risked becoming less than a doctor in their eyes, and perhaps in his own. Here Reeves loosened the bandage, made the adjustment, and kept going as if the conversation had been no more remarkable than asking for another instrument. Marta stood beside the tray and felt something shift in the floor of her thinking. Not collapse, not yet. Something worse. The room did not break when the mistake was acknowledged. The room remained functional. That was the thing she could not easily absorb. Cross noticed Marta's face. Not enough to comment on it in front of the others. Cross was not that kind of officer. She finished the chart, handed it to the orderly, and then said, in the same calm voice she used for everything else, "We'll need a smaller wrap on the next change." "Yes, ma'am," said Reeves. He wrote it down. That was all. Marta waited for the sting of correction to arrive somewhere in the atmosphere, but it never came. The patient remained calm. The doctor remained steady. Cross remained steady. The room kept its shape. That was the physics of it. A structure that could acknowledge a fault without losing form. Marta had spent years believing strength required infallibility. The Americans did not seem to agree. That was unsettling enough on its own. What made it worse was that the patient improved. She could see the drainage moving the way it should. The wound was healing. Nothing had been damaged by the admission of error. On the contrary, the error had been the thing that made the correction possible. Marta took the tray out afterward with a face she hoped was blank. It was not blank enough for Ingrid. Outside the ward, in the break area, Ingrid was talking with two American nurses in a tone Marta had not heard from her before. Not defensive, not cautious, just ordinary. The conversation sounded like a conversation between professionals comparing small frustrations and routine solutions. One of the nurses laughed at something Ingrid said. Ingrid laughed too. Marta stopped just inside the doorway and watched. That was the second problem. Not that Ingrid was changing. She had changed already. What unsettled Marta now was the ease of it. Ingrid moved through the courtyard in daylight with other nurses, as if she belonged there enough to speak without translating herself first. Her shoulders were not tighter. Her voice was not guarded. She was not performing loyalty to the old structure. Marta stood still. She must have looked like she was waiting for something, because Ingrid glanced over and held her gaze for a moment. Not apologetic, not triumphant, just present. Then she turned back to the others and kept talking. Marta remained where she was, a static frame in a scene that kept moving without her. She found Cross later in the corridor and said the first thing that came to her. The doctor accepted the correction. Cross looked at her. Yes. You were not concerned. Should I have been? Marta heard the question and did not answer immediately. Cross stopped beside a wall chart and rested one hand against the frame. If a correction is correct, why would I be concerned? Marta said. Because the order came from a doctor. Cross tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of an idea she found familiar and not persuasive. And if the doctor was wrong? Then she let the sentence sit there. Marta knew what she was supposed to say. She knew the old answer before it reached her mouth. Authority existed for a reason. Hierarchy prevented confusion. The chain had to remain intact. But the answer had holes in it now. Cross waited. Marta said carefully, In my training, the doctor was the final authority. Cross nodded once. In mine, the doctor is responsible for the result. That's different. Marta looked at her. It is not always easy to tell the difference. No, Cross said, but the patient doesn't benefit from us pretending otherwise. That sentence stayed with Marta. Not because it was dramatic, because it was practical. That was the trouble. The Americans kept making their strongest arguments through outcomes instead of ideology. Marta could dismiss ideology if she wanted to. She had been doing it quietly for months whenever she needed to preserve the old framework. Outcomes were harder. A wound improved or it did not. A dosage worked or it did not. A correction saved time or it did not. A doctor listened or he did not. The fact of it did not care what Marta preferred to believe. She looked down the corridor toward the ward. Cross said, You've gone quiet. Marta answered honestly, I was thinking. That usually causes trouble. Marta almost smiled, but not quite. Cross picked up the chart from the wall and moved on. That evening, Marta went back to the barracks with the correction still in her head. She sat on her bunk and took out the notebook. The page she had left open already had half a letter to Anna on it. She had not read it in a while. Now she did. She had written about the work, about the orders, about the way nurses here questioned doctors and were allowed to be right. She had written carefully, with enough restraint that the letter still sounded like something she could defend if anyone else ever saw it. Now the old language felt too thin. She set the pen down and tried to continue the next sentence. The problem with American medicine is its dependence on... She stopped. Dependence on what? On abundance? On machinery? On comfort? On something she could still contrast with German hardship and call that contrast evidence? She had reached too far ahead of herself. She scratched the line through, then started again. The problem with American medicine is not... She stopped again. That one was more dangerous because it was already becoming false. She sat for a long time with the pen in her hand and the notebook open on her lap. Outside, the desert temperature dropped quickly, as it always did. The heat left the air almost all at once, and the cold that replaced it had the clean, dry edge of something that did not care whether she was prepared for it. The barracks was quiet. Ingrid was not there yet. Marta could hear voices outside, low and casual, other nurses talking near the wash line. One of them laughed. Someone answered. The sounds were ordinary enough to make the night feel broader than the room. Marta looked at the page and wrote the line she had been avoiding. I am no longer certain that discipline means what I was taught it meant. She stared at it. It was not enough to be a confession. It was not enough to be a conversion. It was only an opening in the wall. But she felt the draft through it. She could not bring herself to write more, not yet. So she closed the notebook, put it under her pillow, and lay back on the bunk with the cold pressing against the thin blanket. The camp around her kept going. The ward, the corridors, the voices, the order, the correction that had not damaged authority, and the nurse who now laughed easily in the courtyard, and the doctor who had said, without shame, "You're right." Marta stared into the dark and realized that what had unsettled her was not that the Americans were perfect. It was that they were not pretending to be. And that made everything she had used to defend herself feel less like conviction and more like habit. She did not say that out loud. She did not yet know how. Marta tried to finish the sentence 3 different ways. Each one failed for a different reason. She sat at the bunk with the notebook open on her lap, the pen held between her fingers, and stared at the line she had already written the night before. I am no longer certain that discipline means what I was taught it meant. That sentence had been difficult, but at least it was honest. What came after it was harder. Because if she kept going, she would have to decide whether she was still writing to defend herself or writing to tell the truth. She lowered the pen. Outside, the camp had gone quiet in the way it always did after the lights dimmed. The desert cold had arrived fast, pressing itself through the thin walls of the barracks. Ingrid was already asleep on the bunk beside hers, one hand tucked under the blanket, her breathing slow and even. Marta listened to the silence a moment longer than usual. Then she wrote, "The problem is not that the Americans are abundant." She stopped. That was the line she had been circling for months, the one she had used to keep the rest of the thought from becoming dangerous. Abundance was easy to attack. Abundance could be dismissed as geography, industry, luck, distance from war. She looked at the sentence and understood immediately that it was incomplete. She wrote the next line. The problem is that I keep seeing abundance used without shame. Her hand paused. That was closer to the truth than the first line, and because it was closer, it made her uncomfortable in a deeper way. She had not yet decided whether shame was the thing she admired in the old system, or the thing she had mistaken for discipline. She looked at the page, then wrote again. They question one another here. They correct one another here. The correction is not treated as weakness unless it is wrong. She stopped and sat back. There it was. That was the sentence she had not wanted to let herself write because it gave the Americans something she had spent months refusing to grant them, the ability to improve themselves without disintegrating. She had built her whole internal defense around the idea that strength had to be rigid, top-down, and protected from visible error. If a system admitted a mistake, the whole structure trembled. That was what she had been taught. That was what she had repeated. Now she had seen a doctor say, "You're right, Lieutenant," and keep operating. She had seen the patient improve because of the correction. She had seen the room remain intact. The structure had not broken. Her belief in what a strong structure required had. She pressed the pen down harder than she needed to and wrote, I was taught that order is stronger than correction. I no longer believe that is always true. The sentence looked too clean on the page. She did not trust it. She kept going anyway. I watched a nurse here correct a doctor, and the doctor listened. I watched a patient benefit. I watched another nurse work at the same speed as the officers and be treated as if her skill mattered more than the color of her skin. I do not know what to call that except competence. I do not know how to dismiss it without lying to myself. She stopped, then added one more line, smaller than the others. Eleanor did not ask to be admired. She asked to be accurate. Marta stared at that line for a long time. Eleanor had become a constant presence in the ward without ever asking to be the center of anything. She corrected a chart. She passed an instrument. She answered a question. She moved through the room with the kind of calm that made Marta notice her even when she tried not to. It was the opposite of the kind of presence Marta had been trained to respect. It was not force. It was not hierarchy. It was competence made ordinary. That was worse for Marta than any argument, because she could not claim it was theatrical. She could only claim it was real. She turned the page and tried to begin a new paragraph. Nothing came. The pen hovered. She was suddenly aware of the tightness in her throat, the one she had ignored for weeks every time she came close to saying something decisive on paper. Not because she was emotional in the way people often meant the word. This was simpler than that, more physical. She could feel the sentence refusing to finish in her mouth before it reached the page. She had started this letter to Anna as a way of preserving certainty. Now the certainty was the thing dying. She tried again. The reason this matters is that if what? If America is not what I believed it was, that was not enough. If German strength is not the thing I thought it was, that was too large and too vague. If all of the words I used to separate courage from comfort are beginning to fail, that was closer and still not right. She closed her eyes. The barracks was cold now in the specific way of desert nights, not damp, not heavy, just stripped. The heat from the day had left the room completely, and the air felt emptied out. She could hear one of the nurses turning in her bunk near the far wall. A cough in the corridor. Somewhere beyond the compound, a gate closing. Marta opened her eyes and looked at the page again. She wrote, "I keep wanting to say that what I saw here is only material strength, that what is missing in Germany can be replaced by spirit, that sacrifice and endurance are a kind of weapon. But I have seen too many small things now, too many corrections that improved outcomes, too many nurses who know what they are doing and are allowed to say so." The pen slowed. She had reached the old sentence, the one that had lived in her head for months, protected by repetition. She started it. "Germany has what America does not." She stopped. That sentence had been a refuge. She could feel the exact shape of it, the old comfort of it, the moral posture it gave her. But when she looked at the page, she saw that she could not finish it honestly. Germany has what America does not. What? Spirit? Sacrifice? A claim on suffering that proved superiority? A moral depth born from deprivation? She did not believe it enough to write it, and because she did not believe it, she could not write the next word. The pen remained still above the paper. Then, very quietly, as if speaking it aloud might make the room split open, she wrote the line she had been circling around for days. "I think I have been using hardship to excuse incompetence." She read it once, then again. It was not elegant. It was not even especially well phrased. But it was the first sentence she had written that did not sound like an argument she was trying to win. It sounded like a confession. Marta set the pen down. Her hands were cold. She looked at the notebook and felt something in her loosen rather than tighten. Not peace. Not relief. Something more severe than that. The collapse of a structure she had lived inside for years. She was aware suddenly of how much energy she had spent keeping the old argument upright. The explanation for the shortages, the explanation for the errors, the explanation for the silences, the explanation for why the Americans could not possibly mean what they did because what they did was too organized, too unashamed, too effective, She had been making excuses for the sake of a world she no longer fully recognized, and the sentence she had just written made that impossible to ignore. She turned the page and stared at the blank sheet beneath. Then she realized she could not continue the letter right then because the person she was writing to would hear the falsehood if she tried. Anna had been the sister she could lie to only if she believed the lie herself. She no longer did. So Marta closed the notebook. That was the collapse. Not a speech, not a revelation shouted into the night, a stopped sentence, a closed notebook, a silence she had not planned and could not yet explain because the explanation had been the thing falling apart in her hands. She lay back on the bunk and listened to the desert cold settle around her. For the first time since she arrived at Camp Florence, she did not immediately begin rebuilding the argument in her head. She let it stay broken. The briefing came 2 days later. Marta had expected numbers. She got them. She had expected damage. She got that too. But what made the room go quiet was not the scale of the destruction. It was the dryness of the way it was delivered. Cross stood at the front with a folder in one hand and spoke as if she were reading a weather report no one could afford to ignore. Berlin was divided. Hamburg had lost whole districts. Rail lines were down. Hospitals were short on almost everything. Medicines, dressings, clean water, fuel, food. The camps were being closed, the prisoners sorted, the exchange lists prepared. No one in the room interrupted her. She did not dramatize it. That made it worse. Marta sat with the others and listened. Not as someone defending a country. Not quite anymore. As someone hearing what had become of the place she had been taught to treat as permanent. She had spent months telling herself that Germany's strength was different from America's. That hardship created a deeper kind of order. That spirit could survive what machinery could not. Now Cross was describing a Germany in fragments. The words did not need commentary. Marta looked down at her hands. She thought of the old argument and found, with a quiet kind of shock, that it no longer rose first. It came later now, weakened. Not gone, but no longer in command. After the briefing, she walked back to the ward and passed Eleanor in the corridor. Eleanor had a chart tucked under one arm. She looked up, saw Marta's face, and understood enough to ask nothing. Marta said, "They're sending us back." Eleanor nodded. Yes. That was all. No farewell, no meaning layered on top. Just the fact. They worked the final shift together that afternoon. It was a minor dressing change. Nothing dramatic. A routine case. Marta stood at the tray while Eleanor checked the chart and cross-examined the patient. The room moved exactly as it had moved 100 times before. Only now Marta noticed things differently. Eleanor reached for an instrument before Marta asked. Cross corrected a step in the order, and the patient was better for it. The orderly adjusted the lamp without being told. Nobody made a scene. Nobody needed one. The work went on because the work was what mattered. That was what Marta had spent months refusing to understand. When the dressing was finished, Eleanor removed her gloves and looked at Marta for a moment longer than usual. "You're leaving soon," she said. Marta nodded. Eleanor seemed to consider saying more, then did not. Marta was grateful for that and ashamed of being grateful. Cross signed the chart and handed it back to the orderly. "Good work," she said, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Marta heard the words differently now, not as praise, as a statement of function. Good work. That was the shape of the camp she would remember, not the fences, not the numbers, not the arguments she had lost in her own head, the ordinary competence, the correction without humiliation, the patient improving because someone was willing to say, plainly, that a step was wrong. By evening, Marta was back in the barracks with the notebook in her lap. She opened it. The last page she had written on still held the sentence she could not finish. "I think I have been using hardship to excuse incompetence." She stared at it. Then she realized she no longer wanted to continue the letter. Not because she had resolved everything, because she no longer needed the defense. Anna would understand enough from what she had already written. Or perhaps she would not. That no longer felt urgent. Marta closed the notebook and tied it shut with a strip of cloth she had torn from an old seam. Not because it needed protecting, because it was finished. Finished. That word felt strange in her mind. In the old order, finished meant closed, concluded, defended. This was not that. This was finished in the sense of something no longer needing argument. The bus left Camp Florence just after dawn. Marta sat by the window with Ingrid beside her, and the others scattered in the seats around them. No one spoke much. The air inside the bus was flat and stale with the smell of canvas and dust, and too many people trying not to look back. The camp receded behind them. Fences, buildings, the hospital wing, the courtyard where Ingrid had laughed with the American nurses, the corridor where Cross had said, "You're right," the room where the sentence broke. Marta watched it all shrink until it was only a shape in the rear window. Ingrid was the first to speak. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Marta looked down at the closed notebook in her lap. The cloth was tied around it neatly, as if the thing inside had been put away with intention rather than loss. She said nothing for a long time. Then, finally, "I was trying to remember when I stopped arguing." Ingrid turned to look at her. Marta kept her eyes on the notebook. "Do you remember?" Ingrid asked. Marta shook her head once. "No." It was a small answer. Quiet, unadorned, but it was the first answer she had given in months that did not sound like a defense of something she no longer believed. The bus kept moving. Outside, Arizona opened wide in front of them, empty and bright and indifferent. The road stretched into the distance without explanation. Marta rested her hand on the closed notebook and looked out the window. She was not leaving with a new creed, not with a better slogan. She was leaving with the old lie gone quiet. That was enough. The bus rolled on, and for the first time since she had arrived at Camp Florence, Marta did not feel the need to explain the world to herself before letting it pass.